Kavakai ASMR video. I hope that y'all are doing well, and I hope that y'all are excited to jump into my series on ethics, which we're starting today with one of the largest schools of thought in ethics, namely Utilitarianism. And we're going to be talking about Utilitarianism today from the perspective of who is considered to be one of its founders, at least in the more modern version of it. That is John Stuart Mill. And we talked a little bit about Mill last video, but that was about Mill's views on math and Mill's views on how we learn things, which are maybe a little bit more crazy than his views on ethics. At least they're certainly less widely accepted. So anyways, let's talk a little bit about Mill in terms of his biography. So, John Stuart Mill was the son of a philosopher who was heavily influenced by the other founder of modern utilitarian ethics, whose name was Jeremy Bentham. So, his father was really influenced by Jeremy Bentham and was like, wow, utilitarianism is pretty cool, and philosophy is pretty cool, and I believe that you can shape people by their upbringing, so I'm going to raise my child to be a perfect genius utilitarian kid. So that's what he did. And little Mill was learning Greek at the age of 3 and reading discourses by Plato in Greek at the age of 8. So, needless to say, he was a really well-educated kid. So yeah. And after his childhood, Mill basically devoted his life to politics and trying to improve British society. And he did a lot of cool things during that time. He was really progressive for his time. He was a feminist, anti-slavery. He was pro an early version of animal rights, at least sort of animal protection. And he advocated, at least later in his life, some pretty progressive sort of monetary policy that was sort of influenced by socialist ideas. Although earlier in his life that was not the case. He was married to a feminist philosopher, and during his time when he was involved in politics, he was the first British member of Parliament to advocate voting rights for women, which is pretty cool. He also had some bad things about him, though he was an apologist for British imperialism, and he thought that the British were taking barbaric nations out of barbarism and into civility, and that what the British Empire was doing to places like India was actually a good thing. So, nobody's perfect, I guess, but nonetheless, he was pretty cool. And he's also one of the people that's often cited in writing some of the founding texts for modern political liberalism, which is also very influential. So yeah. Anyways, let's get into his views on ethics with utilitarianism. And I brought my Kindle, which I read Utilitarianism on. So I thought I might do some tapping. I love my Kindle. Makes it so much easier and so much faster and sometimes less expensive to read. It's just I've started reading some philosophy on it anyways, even though I usually like to be able to highlight with a pen or pencil in my philosophy books, but whatever. Just figured it would offer a nice counterpoint to my otherwise only whispering videos. Okay, let's get into utilitarianism. So utilitarianism, it's pretty simple in its core idea, which is namely the principle of utility. So, the principle of utility is based off of the core idea of utilitarianism, which is that happiness is good and suffering is bad, and that the morally preferable outcomes are ones in which happiness is maximized and suffering is minimized. Mill specifically in this book words the principle of utility as this, quote, utility, or the greatest happiness principle, holds that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. By happiness is intended pleasure and the absence of pain. By unhappiness, pain and the privation of pleasure. So yeah, that's basically utilitarianism. But even though the core idea of utilitarianism can be explained so quickly, there are a lot of misconceptions, and there are a lot of other interesting parts of Mill's book, so let's get into those. Let's start with the common misconceptions that Mill saw about utilitarianism. So the first one, and perhaps the most obvious one, is that when we say pleasure in our society, we often mean like physical pleasure. So like the pleasure of eating junk food. But Mill wants to correct us and say that pleasure is not just physical pleasure, but also the pleasure of intellectual pursuits, like appreciating art, or the sense of accomplishment at the results of a day when you did a lot of productive things. Those are also pleasurable. And Mill would even say that these types of pleasure are superior to simple physical pleasures, like eating junk food at least, or other physical pleasures. Anyways, so he says that, to quote, it is better to be a human being dissatisfied than better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. And if the fool, oh no, I messed up the quote. Let's start that one over. It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. And if the fool or the pig are a different opinion, it is only because they know their own side of the question. They only know their own side of the question. The other party to the comparison knows both sides. So basically, what he's saying is that the only way to figure out which pleasures are better is to ask people which pleasures are better. And if Socrates says that the pleasure of philosophy is better than the pleasure of eating a really great dinner, then why not believe him? Because he's the one who knows both the pleasure of eating a great dinner and the pleasure of philosophy. So if he knows both, then why not let him decide? And we shouldn't let someone who's a fool decide, because the fool doesn't know what it's like to be Socrates, so he can't compare the two pleasures. So yeah, that's basically what Mill says. I'll put a quote down there as well for that. but I feel like I explained that pretty decently. So, if you know both pleasures, then you're the person who should decide which of those pleasures is better. And Mill thinks that if you ask people who know both intellectual and physical pleasures, or who know just a variety of pleasures, they'll often say that the pleasure of like appreciating art or writing a book or something is actually better than a pleasure that an animal, a non-human animal, or someone who's never done that could experience. So yeah, that's the first misconception. The second misconception is a result of utilitarianism being what is called a consequentialist moral viewpoint. So what that means is that only the consequences of actions are judged morally good or bad. So, an action or an outcome, a consequence. Consequence equals outcome in this case. So, a consequence or outcome is good if it maximizes happiness, and it's bad if it minimizes happiness. So, it might seem that if I, for example, trip and fall while trying to catch someone who's falling from a tree, and then I accidentally punch someone in the back of the head, and they get a really bad bruise, that, under utilitarianism, I'd be a bad person because there was a bad consequence. And although utilitarianism would say, yes, the consequence is terrible, the person falling from the tree still fell from the tree, and now they broke their back, and you just punched someone in the back of the head, and now they've got a really nasty bruise, and both of those created a lot of pain. So that's pretty bad. But that does not mean that I, as the moral agent, am also bad. Because intention still matters even under a consequentialist framework, at least in Mill's conception. So, because I intended to catch the person falling from the tree, when I tripped and fell and accidentally punched the person in the back of the head, I am still a morally good agent. I am still judged as good because my intention was to make an action that would have maximized happiness, or at least tried to. So I didn't make a bad decision, even though the outcome was bad. So that's misconception number 2. Yeah, and those are 2 of the main misconceptions about utilitarianism. So I figured those would be good to get out of the way at first. So now let's get into Mill's justifications that are offered for utilitarianism and why it's right in utilitarianism. So, Mill in utilitarianism does not make claims about objective value, which is independent of perceivers. As he says, quote, "The only proof capable of being given that an object is visible is that people actually see it. The only proof that a sound is audible is that people hear it. And so, of the other sources of our experience, in like manner, I apprehend the sole evidence is possible. It is possible to produce that anything is desirable, is that people actually desire it." So, this fits with Mill's view on math from last time, where Mill said everything was our experience and everything's empirical. Same here. Everything, all that you need to show that something is desirable is that people desire it. So basically, Mill, in order to set utility or happiness as the ultimate end goal and what should be maximized, what he thinks he needs to do is to show that people don't actually want anything but utility, which means that utility is the ultimate end in and of itself, rather than a means to another end, and everything else humans do is just trying to get to utility or happiness. So, what Mill does is to show that things that other people might claim are actually the end goal are actually just means to the end of happiness or utility. So, one of the targets that he sets out to show is not the end goal, which is pretty easy to show this one. I mean, not many people would agree that it is the end goal, but he uses it to lay out sort of a formula for how things seem like ends in themselves, but are actually just trying to get happiness. So, the example is money. So, let's do this gigantic quote. So, just to preface, Mill does not think that money is an end in itself, but merely it was at least started as a means to happiness for why we value it. And through demonstrating that money is this way, he wants to show other things like virtue are this way. So, quote, "There is nothing originally more desirable about money than about any heap of glittering pebbles. It is worth solely that of the things which it will buy. The desire is for other things than itself, which it is a means of gratifying. Yet the love of money is not only one of the strongest moving forces of human life, but money is, in many cases, desired in and for itself. The desire to possess it is often stronger than the desire to use it, and goes on increasing when all desires which point to it ends beyond it. To be compassed by and goes on increasing when all the desires which point to ends beyond it, to be compassed by it, are falling off. It may then be said truly that money desired is desired not for the sake of an end, but as a part of the end. From being a means to happiness, it has become itself a principal ingredient of the individual's conception of happiness. The same may be said of the majority of the great objects of human life, power, for example, or fame, except that to each of these there is a certain amount of immediate pleasure annexed, which has at least the semblance of being naturally inherent in them, a thing which cannot be said of money. So, what he's saying there is basically that money, at first we valued it because we knew that we could get things that give us happiness with it. But now, because we've come to conceive of it as a part of our conception of happiness because it's so societally ingrained, we now want it for itself, even though that's kind of silly because it doesn't actually give us happiness in and of itself. It only lets us get things that make us happy. And then he also compares that to power and fame. But it's a little bit different with power and fame because at least power and fame, according to Mill, give us some pleasure just in and of themselves, which money does not do. So yeah. And then he moves on to virtue, which is another thing. So there's a big field of ethics that started from Aristotle called virtue ethics, which says that good things, or what is good, is to be virtuous. So the goal, morally, is to try and nurture your virtues. So for example, you should seek to be brave, you should seek to be generous, You should seek to be hardworking, etc. You should try and nurture all of these virtues. But you shouldn't really care about really anything else. If you're virtuous, then you're good. So, that's virtue ethics. Very, very simplified. So, that's obviously being another form of ethics and coming from someone as important as Aristotle. It's an important target to show is actually really just a part of utility, according to Mill. So, now you know why virtue is important. Let's see his response. So, quote, virtue, according to the utilitarian conception, is a good of this description. There was no original desire of it, or motive to it, save its conduciveness to pleasure, and especially to the protection from pain. But through the association thus formed, it may be felt a good in itself, and desired as such, with as great intensity as any other good. And with this difference between it and the love of money, power, or fame, that all of these may and often do render the individual noxious to the other members of society to which he belongs, whereas there is nothing which makes him so much a blessing to them as the cultivation of the disinterested love of virtue, and consequently the utilitarian standard, while it tolerates and approves of those other acquired desires up to the point which they would be more injurious to the general happiness than promotive of it, enjoins and requires the cultivation of love, of virtue up to the greatest strength possible, as being above all things important to the general happiness. So I know that was kind of a big chunk of a quote, but let's break it down. So, at the beginning he says, there was no original desire of it, or motive to it, save its conduciveness to pleasure, and especially to protection from pain. So what he means there is that virtue was originally desired because it was, if someone was virtuous, then they would be happier, and the society they live in would be happier, and there would be less pain. So that's why virtue started out as good. And in that way, it's kind of like money or power or fame. But it's different than money or power or fame. Because money, power, and fame, when you care about them too much, they start to actually, as he says, render the individual noxious to other members of the society to which he belongs. So what that means is that if you care too much about money, power, or fame, then you start actually making people less happy and yourself less happy. So those aren't actually as great as virtue is, because if you care a lot about virtue, then you're actually just making everybody happy. So virtue is kind of like money, power, and fame in that it was originally desired because it brings some level of pleasure and happiness. But it's unlike them because there's no point at which you can go too far with virtue. It's always a good thing. So yeah. Another important thing is that Mill views all of these justifications that we just talked about as fundamentally evidence-based and empirical. So what that means is that, as he says, it can only be determined by the practiced self-consciousness and self-observation, assisted by observation of others. I believe that these sources of evidence, impartially consulted, will declare that desiring a thing and finding it pleasant, aversion to it, and thinking of it as painful, are phenomena entirely inseparable, or rather two parts of the same phenomenon. In strictness of language, two different modes of naming the same psychological fact, that to think of an object as desirable and lust for the sake of its consequences, and to think of it as pleasant are one and the same thing, and that to desire anything except in proportion as the idea of it is pleasant is a physical and metaphysical impossibility. So basically what he's saying is that if you really analyze how you think really well, you'll come to the conclusion, and anybody will come to the conclusion, especially anybody, both individually but also if someone else sort of analyzes your behavior with you and you try to make sort of a sociology type thing, you'll end up finding out that desiring a thing or finding it pleasant, as he says, are actually just the same as thinking that it is something which makes you happy or so you can't really want anything except for in as much as it is pleasant and promotes happiness and promotes pleasure. And he thinks that empirically that's just true if you really analyze how people work. So yeah, that's sort of another little bit of Mill's empiricism seeping in to his utilitarian ethics. Anyways, so yeah, those are some of his justifications. But then there's one more large section of the book where he talks about justice. So, Mill thinks that one of the biggest reasons that people don't adopt utilitarian ethics is because they have ideas about justice, ideas of right and wrong, that many people think are more fundamental than or are in conflict with the principle of utility, and saying that whatever promotes the most happiness and reduces the most suffering is right. So, Mill thinks that even though we're predisposed to feelings of justice, they may need to be like our other instincts. Sorry, this is a quote. Like our other instincts, controlled and enlightened by a higher reason. So he doesn't debate that we feel justice, but he thinks that it might be just an emotional reaction that we have, so that we need to subordinate to the principle of utility. So let's look into that a little bit more. So to look into this problem, Mill wants to find what the essential characteristics of unjust and just actions are, and through that he wants to figure out whether those characteristics can be understood with our emotions, or if there's some completely separate thing that then would have maybe more philosophical importance. So let's look at a quote. If in everything which men are accustomed to characterize as just or unjust, some one common attribute or collection of attributes is always present, we may judge whether this particular attribute or combination of attributes would be capable of gathering round it a sentiment of that particular character and intensity by virtue of the general laws of our emotional constitution, or whether the sentiment is inexplicable and requires to be regarded as a special provision of nature. So basically that's what I just said. That Mill really thinks that our feelings of justice might just be an output of our feelings of emotion and not some basic rational force or some basic moral force in our constitution. So yeah. So is that fairness is very important in justice. So from these, Mill concludes that justice is actually just our natural feeling of retaliation or vengeance, as he puts it, which we get just like all of the other animals get. But because we're humans and we use our intellect and reason, we kind of contextualize our concept of justice and universalize it with empathy and reason to range over all societies, all humans, and all sentient beings, which then forms justice. So justice is really just like our innate feelings of self-defense, but we rationalize them and universalize them, and then create justice. So Mill compares this to Kant's imperative, and he says that justice supposes two things: a rule of conduct and a sentiment which sanctions the rule. The first, aka the rule, must be supposed common to all mankind and intended for their good. The other, the sentiment, is a desire that punishment may be suffered by those who infringe the rule. So, he compares this to Kant's categorical imperative, which, to give a super, super basic version, which totally does not cover it, is basically that all of your actions to Kant need to be justified by that. You could want them to become a universal law that everybody needs to follow. So, at a very, very basic level, that's totally imperfect. That's what Kant's imperative is. But Mill is trying to connect to Kantian ethics and try and appeal to Kantian ethics, so that's why he ties in the imperative to his concept of justice, in that it needs to be a rule which could be supposed as common to all mankind, and intended for their good. In this case, good means happiness. Yeah. So that's basically what Mill thinks justice is that it's a set of rules which are common, that can be supposed to be common to all mankind, which are for their good, and the want that people who break those rules are punished. So, Mill thinks that the rights which come from these rules are motivated by the rule of utility. So, society finds it necessary to protect rights that will lead to a functioning society in which all members are safe, and because they're safe, that allows for the most happiness, because people are able to think about more than just trying to stay safe. So justice really ends up maximizing utility. And this realization that justice is fundamentally based on the principle of utility to try and construct functioning societies through social and legal rules, he thinks A, shows that utilitarianism is even more right, obviously, and B, is important for actually resolving conflicts about justice, because if you accept that the basis of justice is actually the principle of utility, then you have a way to sort of figure out who's right when you're talking about just and unjust things. So, let's give some examples, because that might not be clear. So, let's take this debate. People who try their best deserve the same things, because what really matters in what you deserve is trying your best, versus people who have superior abilities should be given more because they have superior abilities. need to try as hard because they offer more to society. So, traditionally, this debate couldn't be answered because the person who's advocating the first point about everybody deserving equal pay for equal compensation for equal effort, they're really basing this off of the idea that everybody should be treated equally insofar as they try equally, which seems fair, seems pretty just, right? And the second point is saying that people should be treated differently depending on how much they're able to do. And it doesn't really matter how hard you try, because unfortunately some people are capable of more things and they deserve more because they're offering more to society. So you should get more back, right? And that also seems kind of reasonable. And previously, that's just where the debate ended. You couldn't really convince someone either way because there was no shared ground. They were arguing from completely separate points. They had completely separate groundings of their arguments. But if they both were to accept that utility is what justice is actually based off of, then they would actually be forced to, they would have a common ground, which they could use to investigate the problem. So, what that means is, it becomes a solvable debate if they both agree that utility is the ultimate ethical principle. Then, theoretically, it's possible to develop an experiment or use empirical investigation to figure out which of those two models actually creates more happiness. So that's pretty cool. Another one would be the idea of one person. It's a very similar debate, but one person might say that we should have taxation on a gradient because rich people have more to give and they should be in charge of supporting poorer people to make everybody's lives a little bit closer together and try and bring the poorest people up to a livable level. And another person might say, no, everybody should be taxed equally because everybody's equal. And if someone's really rich, then they deserve that richness. So they should just be taxed equally as a poor person. Because it's unfair to tax people differently. And although previously, again, they didn't have the same ground. Although previously they didn't have the same ground to stand on in terms of solving the debate. Now they do. If they both adopt the principle of utility, they can figure out whether a gradient tax or an equal tax would actually be better to make people happy. So, even though what Mill would have accomplished there would have been to give them a common ground to debate on, definitely wouldn't resolve the debate because people disagree on what actually would make people more happy. But at least it's a step in the right direction. And finally, on the last part about justice that Mill noticed, which is that equality matters, equal consideration. Mill also thinks that that's related to the principle of utility, because all happiness should be considered equally, regardless of whose it is. So, this follows in Jeremy Bentham's famous footsteps. Jeremy Bentham's famous quote being, "Everybody to count for one, nobody for more than one." So, Mill thinks that viewing justice in this way would lead to many societal inequalities such as sexism, racism, classism to go away, because it would acknowledge that because everybody is capable and equally deserving of happiness. And even though Mill didn't go super far in sort of valuing non-human animals, he definitely did start valuing non-human animals, which was huge for philosophers of his day, at least to their standards. And in utilitarianism, one of the cool things is that he very often refers to just fellow creatures as a category, and sentient life as being valuable, because even though other non-human animals aren't capable of everything humans are, they definitely are still capable of experiencing pleasure and pain, and that's all that matters in utilitarianism. So, yeah. We're going to be talking more about animal ethics later, but anyways, that's a really quick introduction